Well, to discuss this, what does it actually mean, 2.5% in billions? What does it mean for the military? What does it mean for us? And where would we have to cut corners elsewhere? Professor Michael Clarke, a former director of RUSI and a visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, is ready and waiting, as is Mitchell Rees, diplomat, an American diplomat who's worked for the US administrations, including the White House and the State Department, former National Security Advisor to Mitt Romney, and now a distinguished fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Sorry, bit of a mouthful there. Welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Professor Clarke. We're actually spending quite a lot already, aren't we? More than 2% of GDP. So to get to 2.5%, is that a hell of a stretch? Is that a huge task? What do you think?
No, we're spending about 2.3% on GDP now on defence, and that's in cash terms about 60 billion a year, about 60 billion pounds. For every tenth of a percent, so for every 0.1% you want to go up or down on the present basis, that's worth about £1.5 billion. So to take it from 2.3 to 2.5 would add, let's say, 3 billion. Take it from 60 billion to 63 billion, something like that. But of course, that figure keeps going up with inflation and with developments over the years. There's a lot of money in defence, but remember, Britain tries to maintain what they call full spectrum forces. So we're able to do a little bit of everything. So we've got aircraft carriers, we've got top of the range aircraft, we've got an army that, in theory, has got the best sort of equipment, but we have very small numbers of everything. And the key issue is, although this is a lot of money, we long ago slipped below what I call the threshold of strategic credibility, which is to say that when we go to something, when we turn up in the world, everybody likes us being there. We're useful. Everybody's glad to see us. But do we shift the dial strategically? And the answer is no. And people inside the military say that, we are overcommitted now, and we do not strategically turn the dial anywhere in anything that we do, because we slip below that threshold where we really make a difference, a strategic difference. That's the problem.
Right. So in layman's terms, what you're saying, if I hear you correct, is that we're spreading ourselves too thin.
Yes. And we can either spend a fair bit more and maintain our full spectrum forces, or spend about this level, or the level we plan to keep on spending, and we've got to do less and do it better.
And I mean, we've also shifted in our understanding of the threat, haven't we? Because for a long time after 9/11, it was all about terrorism, being very mobile and going into, take out terrorist targets around the world. Now we've suddenly got a land war in the middle of Europe. How do we deal with these different types of threats, and where does the emphasis need to be?
Yeah, correct. That's the thing, Matt. You see, the terrorism threat was never really strategic. It was never really a strategic threat to Britain. It was a nuisance. It was a problem. And we were able to show that we could do something about that, but not at a huge level, but we were able to do something about it. Now, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've got a strategic threat. And there's precious little at the moment that we can really do about it. We can contribute, but the United States has to be the one that takes the lead on that, with NATO behind it, and we contribute where we can. And that's the real problem, all through the teens and the up to the 20s, the Ministry of Defence and the government always assumed, of course, we have to be prepared for war. Of course, that's what we do. But really, look, we've got until 2030 before it gets in any way serious. We've got the next 10 years to sort things out after Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, surprise, surprise, the world isn't like that. We've got to sort it out now. That the strategic threat has hit us about a decade earlier than we privately assumed it would.
Let's bring in Mitchell Rees then. Mitchell Rees, give us the American perspective of this, because we're in Europe and we're a little bit closer to what's going on in Ukraine than you guys are on the other side. I know you're based in London at the moment, but that America is on the other side of a very large ocean. Are you worried that actually, the degree to which we perceive threats depends very much on the geography of where you're judging this from?
Well, I think you feel the Russian invasion of Ukraine far more acutely than we do in the United States. We are relatively safe between two large oceans. That's always been the case. But I want to make 2 points that I think support Professor Clarke's major statement, which is, first of all, U.S. administrations, at least since the mid-'60s, of both parties, had been urging the Europeans to spend more money on defense, going back to Senator Mike Mansfield. And so this isn't a President Trump thing, although he is often attributed with responsibility or the blame, depending on who you ask, of forcing the Europeans to spend more money. When he took office in January of 2017, only 3 European countries were meeting the 2% threshold. The UK was one of them, but the other two were Greece and Estonia, hardly major forces in the military sphere. And so much more needs to be done across the board. And again, it's not a partisan issue. It's bipartisan for the United States. The second point is that the US has to do more as well. Right now, we're spending only 2.7% of our GDP on the military. That's the lowest level of military spending since 1999, 2.7%. And to put that in perspective, Jimmy Carter, who's usually not associated with robust military defense spending, during his administration, defense spending didn't drop below 4.5% of GDP, 4.5% versus 2.7% today. And as Professor Clark mentioned, there's an array of threats out there. The enemy gets a vote. We don't have the luxury of being complacent about the threats that we face.
Okay, let me ask you very bluntly, both of you. First, you, Mitchell Rees, if there was if Vladimir Putin's warnings were to come true and we were engaged in a direct conflict, we as in NATO, with Russia, would the United States have the wherewithal to fight that war successfully, yes or no?
No, I think absolutely. The question is at what cost and what would have to be sacrificed, because to govern is to choose. And so we would have to make some very difficult decisions to draw down forces from other areas, to ramp up production. It would be expensive. It would be difficult, but I have no doubt that the U.S. has the finest fighting force in the world, and that if the American people could be rallied behind that war effort, there's no doubt that we would prevail.
The same question to you, Michael Clark, and actually particularly that point about rallying the population, because I'm looking at my social media screen here in the studio, and there are an awful lot of comments from people saying, we don't need another war, stop this warmongering, enough of this already. I mean, society is divided on this, right? So how do you increase the spending and keep people behind you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you've got to get the point over that we live in very dangerous times, and it's just as dangerous, and arguably, I think Mitchell will probably agree with this, it's more dangerous to do nothing than to do something. And so there is no risk-free option here because we're into a different world, the old world of European security that we thought we were entitled to, a world of prosperity and peace that has existed since the end of the Second World War. Well, we're not entitled to it. We've got to work for it. We've got to spend something on it. And that world is gone. It's been slipping away for 10 years, and it went decisively in February 2022 with the Ukraine invasion. And we go back to some of the other comparators. At the end of the Cold War, 1991, Britain, were spending 4% on defence, about the same, actually, as we spent on health services at the time. In the middle of the Cold War, we were spending 7% of our GDP on defence. And I suspect that the 2020s and 2030s are going to feel much more like the middle of the Cold War than anything we've had in the last 20 or 30 years. So, yes, we've got to try to keep people on board, but we've got to get over the idea that although our day-to-day lives feel pretty much the way they were a year ago, 2 years ago, the underlying reality really has changed. And we've got to find ways of thinking this through. If we do nothing, we will find that first of all, our prosperity, and secondly, then our basic security will slip away faster than we could ever have imagined 10 years ago.
Michael, do you think it's possible to do something or to do more than we're doing right now, as you've advocated, without a major shock? I mean, there are people, defense chiefs are briefing, quietly, that without a kind of 9/11, heaven forfend, no one wants another 9/11, but without a 9/11 style shock, and I'm not sure whether Ukraine delivers that to us, we will never exert that kind of spending from our societies. Michael, you first.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the 2022 invasion in February was a big shock, but it was still a long way away. And as the implications of that shock inevitably wear off, we've normalized the war in Ukraine. We wonder what might happen next. And of course, I'm not going to predict what another shock might be, but keep your eye on what's happening in Georgia in the elections this month and what happens after that. Keep your eye on what happens in Moldova. Keep your eye on what's happening in the Baltic states, and keep your eye on what's happening to the sabotage around Europe, to our pipelines and to our cyber systems and even to our warehouses. Keep your eye on all of that to get a sense of what the Russians and their allies really think that they can get away with Europe apparently indecisive.
But Mitchell, these are places that Michael has just mentioned that a lot of people can't locate on the map, let alone would care deeply about. So that wouldn't administer the kind of shock that is needed, right?
Well, unfortunately, I think that's true. And it's a bit of a cliche, but a lot of it comes down to leadership and communicating the threat, trusting the people to understand. The big issue that really is a cloud over all this debate is the rising isolationism in the United States. So a poll last year from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs showed for the first time ever, a majority of Republican voters decided that the United States should stay out of world affairs. So it's a majority of Republican voters, but we also know that it's increasing among Democratic voters. Again, the argument is let's take care of us at home. Domestic spending should prioritize over foreign and military spending. Again, without explaining clearly to the American people and to international audiences why it's important for a secure, stable world, for our prosperity, our freedoms, we are going to face increasing challenges with defense spending or worse.
I must say, I have exactly that impression traveling around the United States. I think I've mentioned it before on the program, but also in Britain, people telling me over and over again, why should we spend money on something that is probably not going to happen here when we can't afford our own education, national health service? You know, we need to fix the transport system. The demands, the fiscal demands on our prosperity or lifestyles are simply too great. And people's imagination isn't on any front line for this to happen, Michael.
Yes, that's exactly what was the case in the early 1930s. People didn't see why they needed to do it. And they said, well, can't we think of our way out of this? Can't we actually find an accommodation with the fascist powers, not just with Hitler, but with the other fascist powers who thought that the world was on their side? They thought that history was moving towards them, that they were the nations of tomorrow. And sadly, I don't like using 1930s analogies or even Second World War and Hitler analogies, and I never used to use them before 2022. But now I'm afraid they are eerily relevant, and I go back to that. And and in relation to Mitchell's point about the United States, for us in Europe, we're very close to the United States. We're just strategically close. We all are, whatever the rows we have between our politics. But it's like being in the bath with an elephant. It doesn't matter how accommodating the elephant tries to be. If you're in the bath with an elephant, you're going to feel pretty uncomfortable. And at the moment, we're all in Europe. We're in the bath with an elephant.
Okay. Final question to both of you. To what extent do you think the kind of society's reluctance to get behind another war that we may have to fight, or even increase spending, for assistance to Ukraine, is down to the fact that, America especially, but we've been right behind them, have fought too many wars of choice that were not necessary and that failed ultimately. I'm thinking primarily about Vietnam and Iraq. Mitchell, you first.
Well, we have seen a lot of evidence that people in the United States, at least, have lost their trust in institutions, whether it's the government, whether it's the banks, whether it's the military, even whether it's the court system. So there has been an erosion of trust. There has been questioning of judgment, and I think that there's been rising populism, not just in the US, but also in Europe, as we've seen. So there is a credibility gap that needs to be addressed. But the way you address it is not by maintaining your silence. It's by getting out there, making the argument, having the debate, and explaining what the alternatives are. And as Michael said, Europe is strong enough, powerful enough, and rich enough to increase defense spending. There's no doubt about it. And so I think you'll find that the United States will be a willing and eager and reliable ally the more that Europe does, facing this variety of threats that we face, not just from Russia, but also from Iran. And of course, for the United States, we're focused much more on China and North Korea.
Michael, you look worried.
Yeah, no, just going to say that when we think about Vietnam and Iraq, I think Vietnam has gone out of the popular mentality really in Europe, but Iraq is still there. Matt, I mean, I have conversation with people from all over the world all the time. And not a month goes by, not a month, without somebody raising the question of Iraq as an example of Western perfidy, of Western dishonesty, of Western strategic blunder. Now, Iraq was many things, and it's still a controversial issue. But 21 years later, the Iraq War, the 2003 war, is still damaging America's reputation and Britain's reputation and the sort of credibility of Western publics in our leaders 21 years afterwards.
And of course, just finally and briefly, the other thing that is really complicating matters, and I hear this from Ukraine all the time, is the war in Gaza. Why are we defending Israel against Iran if we're not defending Ukraine against Russia? And conversely, we're slamming the Russians for bombing hospitals and schools, in Ukraine, but we're not doing the same when the Israelis do the same in Gaza. First to Michael.
I mean, that's the point. On the one hand, the Gaza war is hugely distracting from what is, in my view, a bigger strategic challenge. I mean, the misery of Gaza, I wouldn't try to gainsay at all. But whatever the misery of Gaza and the Middle East, that is less strategically important to the world than what is happening in Ukraine. And I take that as a very strong view. It's a huge, brutal distraction, but it is also hugely undermining of Western ethics. And it puts the Western powers in general, particularly the United States, but also Britain, absolutely on the spot in terms of its moral and ethical stance. It's extremely unhelpful for everything we're also trying to do in Ukraine.
Okay. Mitchell Rees, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. I know that the United States has been criticizing Israel. They tend to have that criticism conveyed privately, not publicly, as you would always want to do with a close ally. And I think in terms of the Iraq war, I have no doubt that people were disappointed and worse in how the United States persuaded people to enter that war. I don't mind being held to that standard. I think that's a standard we should welcome. People expect more from the United States and from democratic countries. I think that generally we deliver that. We didn't in Iraq, unfortunately. So I think it's just a question of facing up to these issues. And again, trusting the people. If you communicate the case, we need to make the case and win the argument.